Welcome AACPS staff to the video tutorial on using the Smart GX panel. This is the latest smart board being purchased in AACPS schools. In this video, we're going to talk about not only what a smart board is if you're truly new to the world of smart, but we're going to talk a little bit about what makes this panel different than other smart boards that you might have used either in AACPS or in other schools. First off, what is a smart board? A smart board is basically a giant mouse pad hanging on the wall. No kidding, that's really all it is. When you are working at a smart board, every touch of the board is the same thing as a left mouse click if you were seated at your computer. And that means everything you can do from your computer, you can do from the board, and vice versa. That makes a smart board ideal for drag and drop activities for students. They can do sorting, ordering, matching, and so on. A great option to get them out of their seats and up at the board working independently in small groups or even whole class. Now let's talk a little bit about this particular board. We're going to start with some of the hardware. In the bottom left-hand corner of the board here, just on the outside frame, there are some external ports that allow you to plug in another device. These are pictured here on the screen. So starting on the left-hand side, we have a USB-C port, then we have an HDMI, as well as the option to plug in an external USB cable that would give you touch capabilities on the board when working on that other device. And then we have two USB ports here as well. The great thing about these ports right here on the front of the board is if you wanted to connect a different device than what is currently connected, you don't have to try and get behind the board. You don't have to try and get under your teacher desk. You can do that from those connections right there on the front. Now let's turn our attention to the bottom right-hand corner. Again, on the frame, we have some additional buttons. Starting on the right-hand side, you have the button to turn your smartboard on and off. Then you have volume controls for the mounted speakers, access to the settings for the smartboard, a back button to return to whatever menu option you were on just a moment ago, home to return to the main home screen, and then we have what Smart refers to as the ready light. When your ready light is solid green, as it is in the picture there, your board is on, it's connected, and it's functional. If your ready light is flashing green, if it's yellow, orange, or red, your board is not fully connected, and it's time to start troubleshooting some things. Let's talk now about the choices on the board itself that set this particular smart panel aside from the other boards that you may have used. When you're working on the GX panel, you actually have three different devices to choose from. What are you connecting to, and what are you going to do with your board? You have access to your teacher laptop. That should be the default. And when your laptop is connected to the docking station and you turn on your smart board, you will immediately have access to everything that you have on that teacher laptop to use. That means you can not only use your software programs such as Smart Notebook, Microsoft Word, and PowerPoint, but all of your web-based applications like Google Drive, Brightspace, Wixie, Discovery Ed, Nearpod, and so on. The second device that your smartboard is connected to is what is commonly referred to as the onboard PC. This is a Windows 10 machine that is actually mounted on the back of the board. If you switch over to the onboard PC, the first thing that you're going to be asked to do is log on. You're going to use your AACPS credentials to log on as you, which means you'll still have access to all of the things that you would normally have access to on your teacher laptop for the most part. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then the third device that you have to choose from is what is known as the onboard Android. This is another device that is physically mounted on the back of the smartboard that gives you access to just a couple of apps that you can use quickly on the fly without having to navigate into software or applications installed on your computer. These apps are a whiteboard, a browser, and then a couple of others that we'll talk about here in just a moment. Let's go back to that idea of why would I choose to use my teacher PC versus the onboard PC? If they are both simply a Windows 10 device that give me access to everything that is mine, why would I choose one or the other? Well, remember that your teacher PC is the one that is connected to your document camera. So if your lesson today involves using your document camera, that's a great reason to choose your teacher PC over the onboard PC. If you typically save things to your desktop on your laptop computer, that might also be a reason to choose that instead of the onboard PC. However, because the onboard PC will be logged on as you, it'll have access to all of your applications, as we said a moment ago, and even your H drive if that's where you prefer to save things. If you use the onboard PC, you're freeing up your teacher computer for maybe some of your professional needs. You could have your gradebook open. You could have your email open, and you don't have to worry about those things coming up on your smartboard because what is on your smartboard is the onboard PC, not your teacher computer that's on your desktop. Now let's talk about how you actually switch between these different devices. Right over here on the right-hand side, there's a very small double arrow, and I will select on that, and it's going to give me a little pop-out vertical menu here. The option in the center here that looks like a monitor is what I'm going to choose to change between the devices that I'm currently using. Once I select that, it's going to open up the menu here in the center of the screen with all of the different sources that I could choose from to connect to a different device. Right now, you can see that I'm on the device called laptop, and that is the teacher computer. As I said, that's the default. So I have access to everything that is mine in AACPS. The OPS, as it's labeled here, is switching to the onboard computer. So when I select on that one, you'll see it's going to take it a moment to switch over, and what's going to come up is a traditional Windows 10 device. I am currently not logged on to that device, so I would have to swipe up, I would have to click OK, and then it comes up with the option for me to enter in my username and password to log on. And then, as I said, once again, I would have access to everything that I typically have when I'm working on any computer logged on as me in ASCPS. Let's go back to that little double arrow one more time. Select on that monitor icon, and let's talk about the options that you have when using the Android device. As I said, you have access to a couple of apps when using that. We have the Whiteboard, we have the web browser, and then we have those additional apps I referred to just a moment ago. Let's start with the features and functions in the Whiteboard. As you can see, it is open white space for me to begin adding objects, ink, etc., that I might want to manipulate or use as a part of my lesson here. I've got the open white space, the tools across the center bottom, a couple of options in the bottom left and bottom right. So let's start taking a look at what we can do with these different things. Before we get into the whiteboard itself, I want to talk about the pen tray in the center now that we have something where we can actually add some content here. In the center of the board, you have two magnetic mounted pens. There is no difference between the pen in my left hand and right hand. They are both completely generic. But when you pick up a pen, it allows you to add digital ink to the whiteboard there. So you can write, you can draw, you can circle and draw attention to things. You'll notice that one end of the pen is very thin. The other end of the pen is thicker. If I touch the board with the thicker end, I get a different color of ink. And that means that if you want to distinguish what two students are doing when they are working on the board, you can have one write with the thick end and one write with the thin end, and then you'll get different colors of ink. As I said, these are magnetically mounted to the front of the board, so when you're done using them, you can simply push them back towards the white outlined area, and the board will grab a hold of them and pull them in. Let's turn our attention now to the actual tools in the whiteboard application. Starting here on the left-hand side, that paint can icon allows me to switch the backgrounds that I'm using. Not only do I have different colored backgrounds that I can choose from, but I also have, under the arrow here, some additional options for things like lined paper and even some athletic fields and courts. In addition to being able to choose the backgrounds they have, I also have the ability to upload my own image. So if you have a specific background that you want to manipulate objects over top of, that's a great option to bring that background in. That's especially great if you're working with younger students. You want to build in any stationary components as a part of your background and then allow them to manipulate only the objects you want them to move over top of it. Moving on from our backgrounds, we have our pen tool. The pen tool allows us to change the color of ink that we're working with, but not only for the thin pen, that thin tip on the physical pen down here, but also for the thicker pen. So right now you can see that that thin pen is set to purple. If I change it over to blue and I lift up this pen, now when I touch that thin tip to the board, I get the blue that I had set just a moment ago. If I go back into the pen tool, change to the thick pen, and choose something like orange, now you'll see if I touch the board with the thicker pen that I'm getting that orange line of ink. So very simple way to change the default colors of the physical pens mounted on the front of the board. Now we also have access to what they call a calligraphic pen. This is going to allow your writing to take on a bit of a flourish. It gets a little bit thicker, a little bit curlier than the standard pens there. Next, we have the ability to change between how many touches we want to see on the board. So right now we're in the multi-touch mode. So every single point of contact is going to make a separate line on the board. If we go back to the single touch, you can see I don't get all of those lines, but instead what I'm doing is either selecting the objects or drawing with a single line of ink, but not getting all of the different lines that were there. Next, we have a few additional options. We can bring up a cover that allows me to choose only the portion of the board that I want the students to be able to see right now, and you can see I can drag that around. When I'm done using the cover, I can click the X. Next, I have the ability to import a picture in. That would be a movable object that I could bring in. I can bring this in from a USB connected or even an SD card. Again, bringing our attention back to the ports that are mounted down here for bringing that in. Our final option here is to split the screen so that multiple workers could come up and access their own individual workspace. You'll notice when we're in a split screen mode that I cannot continue on outside of my own workspace. So we are truly giving each student who's working at the board their own dedicated space where they cannot cross over and invade their neighbor's space. Next, we have the ability to switch between the pen tool and a select tool. Normally, my finger allows me to write on the board, just as using the pens that are mounted down here on the board does. But if I click on the select tool, I can draw a circle around an object and select it in order to move it, and then accept the change that I've made by tapping anywhere on the board. So you can move objects if you switch to the select, draw that circle around it to select it, and then move it. We have our familiar friends, the undo and redo, and then the trash can down here, which would allow me to remove content from the board. Let's turn our attention quickly down here to the bottom right-hand corner. We have the ability to add additional pages when working in the whiteboard, as well as to navigate between those pages using the back and forward arrows here. Turning our attention to the bottom left, we have the option to save the whiteboard. If you're taking notes for students and you want to give them a copy of today's notes, you would simply plug in an external USB drive, click save, find that device, save it, and then you'd be able to share those notes through Brightspace or any other way that you share with students. We have an arrow here that allows us to drop down the toolbar. So if we're not planning on using the physical tools, maybe we're just going to pick up the pens and write on the whiteboard, we can free up that space down there at the bottom. Selecting the arrow brings the toolbar back up. And then finally, we have a little hamburger menu over here in the corner that gives me some additional options. Things like exiting out of the whiteboard, exporting, importing in additional notes, sharing the whiteboard Whiteboard through a QR code. This might be a great option for, say, high school teachers to give notes to students. They can simply come up with their phone and scan that to get those, as well as the ability to upload directly to your network drive. If we select on exit, it does bring up this reminder that is common across different applications that we work with. Do we want to save this? Do we want to keep it running in the background if we're going to come back to the whiteboard? Or do we just truly want to exit out? If you choose exit, you're right back on the main Android screen here. Our second application is the web browser. This is going to open a browser. The default page for the browser can be set to ClassLink, giving you access to all of the applications that you might choose to use here in AACPS quickly, again, without having to go into the teacher computer if you prefer. I'm going to close out of that. And finally, we're going to look at those other apps. So there's a handful of apps that you have in here, things like eShare, access to files. You even have settings, which allows you to add additional applications that you might be able to find in here from the list of apps that are available here for you to add to that additional apps area. That's been a quick overview of the new GX panel. If this is not the board that you have installed in your classroom, please look at the other smart boards contained in this series.